Hello, welcome everybody on the internet watching live or archived video. I'm super excited for today's author talk. Last week for our Lavender Lit Book Club, we read a pretty spanking new book called This Has Always Been a War by Lori Fox. And today I'm super excited to be talking about Lori. Before I introduce them, I'm going to read the excerpt on the back of the book. So This Has Always Been a War by Lori Fox. Here we go. Capitalism has infiltrated every aspect of our personal, social, economic, and sexual lives. By examining the politics of gender, environment, and sexuality, we can see the ways straight, cis, white, and especially male upper-class people control and subvert the other queer, non-binary, BIPOC, and female bodies in order to keep the working lower classes divided. Patriarchy and classisms are forms of systemic violence which ensure that the main commodity of capitalism, a large, disposable, cheap, and ideally subjugated workforce, is readily available. There's a lot wrong with the ways we live, work, and treat each other. In essays that are both accessible and inspiring, Lori Fox examines their confrontations with the capitalist patriarchy through their experiences as a queer, non-binary, working-class farmhand, laborer, bartender, bushworker, and road dog, exploring the ugly places where issues of gender, sexuality, class, and the environment intersect. In applying the micro to the macro, demonstrating how the personal is political and vice versa, Fox exposes the flaws in believing that this is the only way our society can and should work. Brash, topical, and passionate, This Has Always Been a War is not only a collection of essays, but a series of dispatches from the combative front lines of our present-day culture. Yeah, welcome, Lori Fox.
Hi, it's really nice to meet everybody. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Lori, you want to get started with, well, I guess I already said your name, but you can introduce yourself again, your pronouns, and then what you want people to know about you.
Well, I'm a queer non-binary person based out of Whitehorse, Yukon. For anybody watching who doesn't know where that is, it's the Canadian territory smack next to Alaska. So I'm a high northerner. And my pronouns are they, them, and I'm a working class person and a journalist who works purely freelance here in the territory. And I have lived here for about 10 years, but I have traveled extensively throughout Canada and the northern US during that time as well, as I've sort of moved in and out of being housed and unhoused.
Wonderful. Well, I gave people a little excerpt about your book from the back. Do you want to tell us, well, first of all, the title is what gravitated me towards this book. It's an incredible title. This Has Always Been a War, captivating, simple. How did you come up with, what is the story behind this title?
Well, the title is, of course, based off the titular essay. But more broadly and more generally, and that's a question that's come up a lot when I've done talks like this. And I think that the way that we are integrated as working class people into a capitalist culture is inherently designed to hide the both passive and active violence of that culture. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, discourages us from actively moving against capitalist culture. We are subjugated by our ability to make money. And if you don't have enough money, you don't have power. Mm-hmm. Someone with $10,000 has far more power and far more options in that precise moment and in their day-to-day life than someone who has $1,000. And I'm Canadian, and so just for an American audience, we love to tout our big shit brick free healthcare system, and we do have a better healthcare system than you do in the States. Mm-hmm. But things like medication, therapy, dental work, going to the eye doctor, any of those things that you might need, including medications for things like cancer, diabetes, things that can kill you, things that do kill people every day, are things that we pay for out of pocket if we don't have benefits. We like to tout this like perfect system, and it's nothing but like pandering and nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
But in a system where you can actually die because you can't pay for something, that's an act of violence. That's a
Mm-hmm.
passive act of violence meant to subjugate you. And that goes from everything from medical care to food to housing. If you can't pay to live somewhere, like I live in a community where it is from about, depending on the year, but like late November to mid February ish, anywhere from negative 25 degrees Celsius to negative 45 degrees Celsius. You can
Yikes.
freeze the fuck to death 8 months of the year here. And you still have people who are homeless and living on the street. And that's bonkers.
Mm-hmm.
That is an act of violence. If you can't pay to be inside and be warm, you can't pay to be alive.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about war, when we're talking about acts of violence, or when we're talking about conflicts, I don't see how you can't see that as an ongoing battle, as an ongoing physical conflict between people who want you to do a certain thing and be a certain way and obey, when the consequence of not obeying is punishment, misery, and death. So I think that the title, when you roll back to think about that, and when you take a larger view at the way that capitalism has extended throughout our society in this way, I think it's fairly self-explanatory.
Mm-hmm.
This is and always has been a war. I actually just finished reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, or rereading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
I've never read
Um, oh, it's a famous treatise on the meatpacking industry in the
that.
1920s and 30s, and about largely Eastern European immigrants trying to make it in that field, and just how disgusting their work conditions were. Like one of the big changes that it made was it actually instituted a meat inspection standard. um, but just people living in abject squalor and misery
Mm-hmm.
because they couldn't afford to do basic things and being treated as subhuman. And that continues to this day. It's just more covert.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the title is just as apparent as the like points that you make in your book. Something we talked about in book club, something that multiple people brought up, was the fact that they thought that they were going to be reading like a heavy theory sort of book where it was just like word like big words that are like for academics and like theorists. And they were like, I loved how you took like everyday struggles that like working class people face, which everybody in book club is a working class. I feel like a lot of queer people are, just because, you know, odds are stacked against us. They just loved how you related every little thing in life to the broader sense of oppression. So yeah, that was, I mean, it was, yeah, a fantastic book. I already told you that I love this book. It was incredible. Um, yeah, that was great. What else? Okay, so like let's talk about like the actual putting this book together. This is your debut book, although you are a journalist, so you have multiple like articles and, you know, op-eds published. How was the like publishing side of putting this book together? Like you said, this book was like a collection of essays that were previously published, but you clearly had to add to make it like a cohesive book. How was that writing process like for you?
So some of these essays are based on essays that I had written before, and but a lot of them are brand new. And just to go back to your point about language, I'm a journalist and I'm a Canadian journalist. And something that's really weird about Canada is that we have this like very like British upper lip
Mm,
about what we can and cannot say and what is and is not appropriate language, that is deeply rooted in class. And I'm not sure if similar conversations are being had in the States, but here in Canada, we have a very class stratified media system. Working class people like me very rarely make it to work in major Canadian newspapers or publish in big Canadian newspapers regularly. And what that results in is a huge class disparity and a huge misunderstanding between what is actually happening and what the data suggests. And one of the things that in interviews, Canadian interviews that I've come up with a couple times. The first 3 interviews I did with like CBC and a couple other outlets that are quite large in Canada, and they're largely populated by like middle class white cis heterosexual people who have never worked in service a day in their life. Like I can tell when I'm talking to someone whether or not they're a working class journalist or not in these interviews. It's like the tells are huge.
Yeah.
The thing that kept coming up for me was in the first 3 interviews that I did was every one of those people said to me, "This is a really hard read. I found your language really challenging."
Really?
And what I didn't understand that was code for, it took me a couple times to understand that what that was code for was that these are people who have never seen the word cunt in print.
Oh.
Or fuck in print. Because you don't say that. You don't say that, or you can't write that in journalism. And so part of the publishing process for me and part of the writing process for this for me was being able to be let off my leash. And a huge part of this, because as a freelancer, I'm asked to write really tight because I'm paid by the word, and that's changing a little bit now that I have a little bit more, for lack of a better word, maybe cachet with some of the publications that I'm working with, where they're more willing to pay me by the piece than by the word. But when I'm writing by the word, they're like, we want 800 words and we want it tight, and it can't be over 800 words, and you can't use these words, and let's renegotiate how you're expressing queer concepts so that straight people don't feel left out of the conversation. Which my general response is typically this, but I get you still got to eat. And so the biggest part of publishing and the biggest part of writing this book for me was allowing myself the space to stretch. Typically speaking, when you're writing as a journalist, you're writing between even for a medium form. For a medium form, you're doing about 800 to 1,200 words, and for longer form, you're doing maximum 2,500. 3,000 is a little unheard of. I've only published a 3,000 word piece in a print journal once. So it was just letting myself expand into that space and not having someone looking over my shoulder, not having a cis white guy looking over my shoulder being like, you can't use that word. It's not polite. Our readers won't like that. So that was the most freeing part of that process for me.
I love that. And you published with Arsenio Press, which is like a Canadian queer house. So I'm sure they were
Arsenal Pulp, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Arsenal Pulp. Yeah. I do that thing where like you read, but you don't know how to pronounce the word. So I say also doesn't help that I'm not from America. So like my vocabulary is not here.
And I mean, I think that for a book called This Has Always Been a War, working with a publishing house called Arsenal Pulp is probably up my alley. But
yeah, for sure.
And they've been great. They're a wonderful publishing house, and they sell a lot of books in the States as well.
Yes, they do.
And they're not specifically queer, but they publish a lot of queer authors, especially our first books.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have a couple books from this publishing house. Them and like AK Press in the States are like 2 of my favorite publishing. That's off topic, but. I'm super shocked that your first few interviews said that it was so hard to read this book. Maybe it's because they didn't realize how much violence people go through because of the state, but literally everybody, and myself included, like I picked up this book. I like to read like memoirs and like political stuff typically. And so like right now I'm reading Captive Genders, which is like also an anthology about like the prison industrial complex and how it relates to gender. And these essays, sometimes I have to skip over them because I'm like, it's too academic for me. Like, I can't understand a single thing you're trying to say, which I think a lot of like people who are like leaning towards, like radical leftists or like, whatever, they use a lot of big words because that's what theory like talks about. That's what theory requires. But this book was incredibly easy for me to read. This is like I read it like so fast. And yeah, I related to it. So maybe, yeah, it's because they're not like a working class person who doesn't experience any of the things that you have experienced in this book.
I think that there's two interesting things that you just said there, and the first of which is that, writing from a Canadian context, I often say to my American colleagues, like, Canadians are just as racist and just as classist and just as exploitive and just as capitalist as our southern neighbors. We have this like friendly beaver vibe, and it's weird. But what we're really good at as a culture is just like smiling super politely and like pretending like everything is cool. And so instead of talking in the way or like even protesting in the way that you folks do in the South, we're very like culturally we're very like staid, and this is not not a compliment to us at all. But we like to pretend that everything is fine.
Like,
and
proper.
So the conversations that we're having in this book don't get had. And when I did an interview the other day with someone from the Canadian Association of Journalists. Sorry, not the Canadian Association of Journalists, from Canadian Press, which is the equivalent of AP, of American Press. It's a news service. And I could tell immediately that this human was not a working class person, because the question that she asked me was, "What do you mean by emotional labor in serving?" And I had to take a minute and hang back. And because it's very stratified in terms of who gets to be a journalist and who gets to be in media, the viewpoint is very stratified. And the language that I use in the book is the language of the working class. And it's the language that you find in kitchens, and it's the language that you find when you are working late nights, and it's the language that you find when you're in bars or construction sites. And that language isn't different between Canada and the US. The difference is, I think, that our media and the average middle class person, as a result, has a lower exposure threshold to that.
Absolutely.
And to the academic language, I've read a few books recently where In Defense of Looting is a good example of this, I think. And I think there are some inherent issues with that book to begin with. But In Defense of Looting baffled me because you're talking about these quintessentially racialized and quintessentially class-based issues around capitalism, but you're using explicitly the language and style of the oppressor. Who are you writing for?
Yeah.
Who are you talking to? And it comes across a couple times. The mushroom at the end of the world, imagining life in capitalist ruins, is a really good example of this. And a lot of environmental nonfiction is a really good example of this. Who are you talking to? It can't be the same 30 people over and over again who have PhDs, and that's what it feels like for me. So I was very specific and very intentional in the way that I wanted to write this book, and I'm very specific and very intentional in the way that I write a lot of my essays and op-eds now, because I want them to be accessible. Like, because I'm in my other life, I'm a science journalist. I handle thick, heavy reports full of jargon, and my job is to make them accessible to everyone.
Right.
And if you can't do that, you have failed. And I think one of the things I'm proudest of in this book is that it is accessible to everyone, and people who have difficulty with the language have difficulty with the language, not because it's unreadable, but because they have difficulty with the concepts behind the word choices, I think.
Yeah. And that answers my question, which was like, did you write this book intended for working class people? Which you clearly have, because I'm a working class person, and I am telling everybody that this book was very accessible. And I feel like a lot of books books say that they're accessible, but like maybe it's just me without a higher education. But like this book was the most accessible book that relates everyday topics to the broader concept of oppression.
And I think that's because we, as working class people, we often get written about and we don't get to write about ourselves because those opportunities aren't there. I did an essay for Catapult a little while ago about publishing as a working class writer and how difficult that was, and how much more I felt was at stake for me in my first book than a middle class person would, because you have the room to fuck up.
Yeah.
If you have money, you have room to fuck up. But I worked like 80-hour weeks to put this book together. And if I fucked up and it didn't sell or no one wanted it, my career is basically over. I won't have another opportunity to get myself to, like, I won't have the physical strength or financial strength to get myself together to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that being said, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just think that that's part of why you see you don't see as many. I like in Where the Fuck Are We in Your Dystopia, I break down who's writing these books.
Yeah.
And they're middle class white ladies, and most of them actually have PhDs.
Yeah.
And that says so much about who gets to publish. Like there's this tweet going around right now about like how cis white guys don't get to don't get a fair shake anymore. And when you look at the stats, that's an absurd comment to make. The perception that just because now you actually have to compete at a fair level and you're getting rejected because you aren't as good as you thought you were is discrimination is bananas.
Yeah.
And you see that in who, like, you just have to look at the numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's fucking crazy. So now that we're talking about this, how has people, because your book has been out for like 3 months now, right? It came out in May.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what time it is. So it's been out for a little bit. How have people been responding to it? I mean, I hope in my book club, we fucking loved it. How have you seen it? I did see like one of your tweets because I have to look people up before I interview them. And you were like, you saw your book in a mainstream book store, and yeah, how's it been for you?
So I think that my publishing experience is probably different than other people's publishing experience just because of the size of the community that I live in. So again, for Americans, and I find that this is the hard part that, I mean, even a lot of Southern Canadians don't really understand this, but I live in Whitehorse, and the closest town, the actual closest city to me is Vancouver. And so that is a 2,000 kilometer, let's call it 1,000-mile drive.
Okay. You like lost me at kilometer. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's call it 1,000 miles.
Okay.
For the sake of interest, it takes about 2-3 days in the summer, 3-4 days in the winter. And there is literally, excuse me for one moment, I'm sorry. Someone doesn't have good boundaries. And there's nothing. I mean, there are small towns, but there's really nothing between us and there that you would consider a city. And I live in the Yukon, which has a population of 40,000 people.
Wow.
In an area the size of Spain.
Wow. Yeah.
So people know me really well. And so it's been a little too personal in some ways. Like I spent the first month out of territory specifically because I didn't want to answer questions in person where I live, because people feel very entitled to your time, and that's something that I've experienced as as an op-ed writer and as as a political critic in this territory as well. It was really cool to see my book in a big bookstore, and I've seen it a couple times in smaller bookstores up here, but we're quite isolated, so it doesn't really feel like it's a real thing. I will be in Toronto at the end of September for the Toronto International Festival of Authors. I've been invited to that. Nice. And that'll be the first time I've been in like a big city in a couple years. It's not that I don't, like, usually I travel more, but due to the pandemic, I haven't been able to. And I think that that's going to feel a little bit more real. It's been really bizarre to like go pike fishing and come home with like a cooler full of 30 pounds of fish and be cleaning it and then check my phone and have my publicist be like, by the way, you have to go do an interview in like 2 hours. I hope you're ready for that. So it's a bit of a weird disconnect due to the isolated nature of my community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Small town, people know you. I'm sure this book was a very like I mean, I don't know, but if I had to write a book, I'm sure it would be a very vulnerable thing because you write a lot of personal stuff that's happened to you. So now people feel like they're entitled to your time because they read your stories and, you know, your life story. And
I think the hardest part is like the emails that I get because I never know, like I get like a lot of like, I've gotten quite a few, I should say, and I've had these before with other pieces that I've written, but like particularly with the book. And I've had some really lovely responses to my book, like responses like I got a letter the other day from like a 65-year-old grandma in Kingston who picked up my book because her granddaughter gave it to her and she ended up loving it.
mm-hmm.
And I love getting emails like that, but sometimes I get like really heavy emails about very personal stuff because people feel like they can share with me.
Yeah.
And I never know how to respond to them.
That's someone who also lacks boundaries.
Yeah, like there's a lot of lack of boundaries, and I don't know what to like. You want to emotionally be available for them, but you also can't be emotionally available for all of them.
Yeah, I mean,
that part has been a bit overwhelming.
Mm-hmm, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure your book is going to like people are going to relate to it because a lot of people go through the same things that you have gone through, and yeah, I mean, the book is a gift, and like people shouldn't be entitled to your time. So I hope that you can set hard, firm boundaries. I'm a boundary lover. And not get super overwhelmed by that. But it sounds like people are loving your book, which I'm super happy about because it truly is an incredible book.
I think it's actually the first time that, and we've been talking about language, and it's this, like I write for the Globe and Mail, which is one of Canada's biggest newspapers. It probably means nothing to you, but it's one of Canada's biggest newspapers. It's like our equivalent of like the New York Times.
Oh, okay.
And I had a conversation with one of my editors there a while back about the kind of language that I choose to use in my op-eds, and specifically about like the word femme versus the word woman.
Mm-hmm.
And him worrying that people weren't going to understand, and me explaining to him that this is how people get exposed. And I think my book and some of my op-eds are the first time that, because people tend to silo themselves, right? Like they tend to surround themselves with people who are like themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that my op-eds and my essays are sometimes the first time that cis middle-class people get exposed to a viewpoint from a queer working class person from the trans community. Mm-hmm. And that viewpoint isn't necessarily about a trans or queer issue. It's about a larger, broader issue that impacts everybody. And I think that's the place where I'm getting some really interesting feedback from people. And it's really, it's important to me, but it's also been really beautiful to just like be in touch with these different communities and to expand them and expose them to our community that they would never otherwise have been able to take part in or to even consider. And I think that that's like the first step to breaking those class barriers and those like gender and sexual diversity barriers.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
that does make sense. Yeah, I see that for sure. I want to shift a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about what's in the book without like telling people like y'all should go buy it and go read it. But I did want to talk about your chapter. Which chapter was it? I think it was Every Little Act of Cruelty. No, it wasn't. It was Creatures of Impossible and Tremendous Beauties, your second chapter. Okay. This chapter was like, I mean, this book was like eye-opening for me on many topics, but you mentioned The Last Unicorn. This chapter was like, it was beautifully like positioned, because you go back and forth between what happened with you and that manager, and the last unicorn, which people will be like, what, how does that relate? And as someone who's, again, I'm very young, and I also am not from America, so I never watched The Last Unicorn, but it is my wife's favorite movie, they are also non-binary and be wife, but they hate when I call them that. That's their favorite movie. And you talked about it. And after I read this chapter, I had to text them and be like, oh my God, Lori Fox just commented about, or just related The Last Unicorn to like gender violence and trans erasure. And they were like, how? And I was like, I can't tell you, you have to read it. So can you tell us, how does The Last Unicorn have to do with gender violence and trans erasure? Like, what was the connection that you made there? Because I feel like a lot of non-binary people's favorite movie is The Last Unicorn, and I'm only basing this off of like 2 other non-binary people loving The Last Unicorn.
I actually like did some background research about The Last Unicorn after I wrote this essay, and I was like, man, a lot of queer people love this movie, and I understand why. And like, it was my favorite movie as a kid, and it wasn't even that I was like I was not like a unicorn. Like, I liked unicorns as a kid. Like, I think most people who are like coded feminine at birth are taught that this is a thing that you should like. But it was really because of this movie. And I was obsessed with this film. I watched it over and over and over. I've also read the book, and I would highly recommend the novel. Peter S. Beagle is the author of the novel, but he also wrote the screenplay for the film. So it holds very true. And just the artwork is beautiful. Mia Farrow voices the unicorn. Like, it is a classic. Just whether you're gay, straight, or otherwise, whatever the fork for your pie is, you should probably watch this movie. But like, I was trying to parse, that essay is based on an earlier essay that I wrote specifically just about what had happened in terms of my gender and the way that I was treated at that particular job in an article for Vice. Mm-hmm. And I looked at that and I was like, something is missing. Something is missing from this. There's got to be a larger cultural context here that I can talk about. And, you know, I'm a really big believer in like just sort of like letting my instincts speak to me. And I started thinking compulsively about The Last Unicorn around this time. And I rewatched it and I was like, holy fuck, this makes so much sense. And so The Last Unicorn, for those of you who have not seen it, is a fantasy movie and novel about a creature who lives alone in the forest, a unicorn who lives alone in the forest and hears in passing that they are the last of their kind. And so it's like an epic fantasy movie where they like leave to go and find out whether or not they are or not, and make friends along the way, and they do all but no one can actually see them. Only a handful of people can actually see them intrinsically for what they are, which is this like incredibly beautiful creature. Everybody else who is used to seeing one thing or another thing only views them as a horse. And then partway through the film, they are, in order to save their life, turned against their will into a human woman and forced to live as a human woman despite all of their desire to do so, and their very vocal wish to not do that. And over time, they eventually become indoctrinated to this form and lose themselves along with a lot of their power in the film. And around this time, they basically cease to be a playing character, because they're playing a role and not being themselves. And at the end of the film, they're restored to their true form. And what that means for them is that they lose a lot of the relationships that they had built as this cisgender beautiful woman, but it's the only way that they can actually live. And I think that speaks to a lot of trans and non-binary people. It certainly speaks to me. And again, I think the film is definitely worth a watch. And in the essay portion, like in my personal experience portion of that chapter, I was basically trying to be trained into being a good little girl and looking the way that my employer expected me to look and walking the way that my employer expected me to look. And I think what attracted me to that film as a child is that the unicorn is beautiful and strong, but gives zero shits. They do not care
Yeah.
what anyone else thinks, and they get to do whatever they want, and they have complete autonomy over their body in a way that, as someone who was coded as a little girl, was very attractive to me. I don't know how many. I honestly don't know how many people are watching this, but like, if you've grown up coded as a little girl, people feel entitled to touch you in a really weird way, like your hair, like to touch your hair, or to like hug you or hold your hand, even total strangers, in a way that would be like to even people who touch people's babies without asking them. I think that's weird.
Yeah.
You're touching other humans without their permission, and especially little girls. And you're coded right from the very beginning. This is how you should be and how you should look and how you should act. And there are subtle microaggressions and subtle punishments that come with not meeting that. And I'm sure that speaks to everyone, queer people. But in The Last Unicorn, it's incredibly apparent because she's like, they are physically forced to be a she without any consultation or desire on their part, and the punishment for not doing that is death. Does that answer your question?
Yes. I watched The Last Unicorn for the first time with Kat, and because it was their favorite movie, and I did not get any of that. I was like, I didn't catch any of that. But like when you said it in your book, I was like, no fucking shit. Yeah. Duh. So I'll go back and I like doing that anyways, like going back and watching movies and like nitpicking everything. But that was one of the, like, this book just contains so many moments like that where I was just like, fuck, how did I not think of that before? It's brilliant.
Because
so
we're trained not to see it.
That's true.
And you don't see it until you actively expose yourself to a variety of, like, I think, that essay and Where the Fuck Are We in Your Dystopia share a common theme, which is that in isolation, you probably wouldn't notice that about that movie. But when you start pairing all of these things side by side and looking about what they're saying as a meta narrative, that's when you start to see the pattern that you're being taught to accept.
Absolutely. And I will just say, as a side note, Where the Fuck Are We in Your Dystopia, those first two chapters about like an angry femme at the bar, that I like literally highlighted that entire, I was like, yes, all of this, yes. So y'all should buy the book and see what I'm talking about. Okay, so now we're speaking of gender. A question that I had for you about gender was, what does gender euphoria look like for you? I feel like in queer spaces, we talk a lot about like trauma, which is something that we face, or like hardships. But I want to ask you, what makes like you feel euphoric in your gender? And it could be like an activity or like whatever.
I'm sorry, I beg your pardon.
That's okay.
A couple years ago, when I was really first starting to think about like my gender and where I wanted to be with myself, and this might not speak to a lot of the people watching, but I'm a bush queer. We're outdoor people and we live in rural communities, and we do a lot of stuff that has to do with being physically on the land. And I think that's the most gender affirming thing for me, because when I get to be out in my canoe fishing, or I'm on a moose hunt, or I'm in the backcountry wayfinding.
You hunt moose?
They big.
They're big.
They're big. Anyways, when I'm doing these things, the backcountry rewards cunning and care for others and intelligence and skill and drive. And it actively punishes stupidity, greed, and arrogance. And a lot of like, because I live in a community, you have to understand that like I live in a community, and anyone who's been to Alaska and the Yukon have basically share a culture. Like we're much more culturally attenuated to each other than Alaska would be to say California or even to Texas. And the Yukon is much more attenuated to Alaska than we would be to Ontario or even some parts of southern BC. And the thing about that is it kind of like there's this whole like big white guy colonial bullshit that's at the front of that. Like I'm the man and I'm the master of the universe and I'm here to triumph over this nonsense. And that's always the first guy who dies. Like that's always the guy who has to get rescued. That's always the guy who accidentally shoots off his last 3 toes with a 30-06. That's always the guy who eats the wrong mushroom because you told him not to, but he sure knows better than you anyways, and then you gotta helivac that motherfucker out of there. Because it's arrogance. And so in so many ways, the backcountry and the bush are not designed for the patriarchy. Men like to try to believe that space is for them, but I can split wood, haul water, clean a moose, catch a fish, set up a tent, select a site, and find my way to the woods better than 90% of most men I know. Because it's not about gender. It's about what I can do with my body and being able to learn and adapt. And I think for me that's the most euphoric I feel in my body. And the place that I feel most at home is this space where you're so aware that gender is a construct. And because the guy who will tell you that he knows what he's doing is the last guy you should trust. It's the person who says, okay, what are we going to do and what are our goals and how are we all going to work together? And oh, by the way, I saw fish over here. That's the guy you want with you in the backcountry.
Absolutely. Yeah, that speaks to like collective organizing or like mutual aid work or, you know, all the other stuff that I constantly talk to everybody about, how divide and conquer is like a real thing that works. And we need collective community, healing community.
And you know, I'm an environment reporter and a science reporter, so it's my pleasure in many instances to work with a lot of First Nations folks up here. We're on Kwanladun and Tonquichan Council First Nation territory here in Whitehorse, and there are a variety of First Nations throughout the territory. But that that machismo, that like I'm the lone man in the woods who can take care of you. That's a very specifically white settler patriarchy colonial piece of bullshit that tries to stick people into boxes. And I know tons of women up here and like tons of cis women and tons of queer women who never get to learn how to split wood or who I've taught to shoot because men keep those skills from you.
Yeah.
Because like specifically white men keep those skills from you. And that's, you know, it's a very specifically white colonial patriarchal capitalist mentality that by being out in the backcountry in the way that I can be out in the backcountry, I feel that that's a form of both gender euphoria and anti-capitalist praxis.
I love that. Yeah, and that I mean, you sort of answered this question. My next question was going to be because your book talks a lot about, well, you not choosing to, but having to like live in the woods. My question was, how is your relationship to nature, which you kind of touched upon, but if you want to say anything else about that?
I just like that I get to be an animal when I'm out in nature. Like I'm very at home in the woods and I'm very at home. Like one of my favorite things to do is to spend like a Sunday afternoon just out in my canoe fishing, hunting season is coming up here, and I've got a buddy that I go with all the time. She and I have a Femmes and Dems only hunting group, because you definitely want more than one person when you're bagging a moose. But and we do, and we eat everything. Like my dogs eat the bones, and I process whatever fish is left into dog food, and nothing gets wasted. And I think that that's part of my anti-capitalist praxis, is being able to work outside of a capitalist system where I'm not paying for things, and I hold value for them in a way, and for the things that, like, I mean, I find that there are some people who are very squeamish about the practice of hunting and fishing, and I understand. Personally, I feel that's from a large lack of exposure, but I have tremendous respect for the things that, for the lives that I take, and I eat those just like any other animal, and I have a huge respect for them, and also waste nothing in a way that capitalism teaches us is silly. Like, you can always tell a southerner has been fishing when they've just taken like 2 fillets off a pike and thrown the rest away, because they don't know how to deal with it, and they don't want to learn.
I love that. As a vegan person, people always like want to ask me like, oh, but if you had to like kill a chicken, I'm Brazilian. I've literally eaten every single like meat there is in the world every single day. And the reason I'm vegan is not because I'm like killing animals is bad. It's the way that capitalism has created this need for what's it called? Farming, industrial.
Factory farming?
What was it? Factory farming. Yeah, factory farming. It doesn't line up with my values, but like, my good friend who's like also a fisherman, who like we go camping with all the time. He's like, if I caught a fish, would you eat it? And I'm like, yeah, because you caught that fish. Like,
we call that Yukon vegetarian.
We call that what?
We call that Yukon vegetarian. When you only eat game and meat that's farmed by people that that's Yukon vegetarian.
I love it. All right, I'm Yukon vegetarian then. I'm here for it. All right, so time's running up on us. I've got 2 more questions for you. The second to last question is, what are some books or authors that have inspired you to either create this book or just in general life? Basically, this is me asking you, like, what else should I read that is like your book? Because I fucking loved it.
And I meant to have a stack of books sitting here, and I don't. But excuse me. But a lot of really great books have come out recently, and I read extensively. I read a lot of audiobooks because I'm busy, and so it's something
which
I
is
can
reading
do.
for people.
Which is reading, and anyone who tells you that audiobooks isn't reading is being classist, because having the leisure to sit and read and only do that is a class privilege.
I love it. Yeah.
Full stop. I will fight him. I will fight the person who tells me otherwise. My friend Taja Issen has a great book out right now called Some of My Best Friends, and that's about basically like lip service in race and culture. She's Canadian. She used to be an editor at The Walrus. She's recently moved to New York, so you may have seen her book around. She's definitely a big inspiration for me. I read a lot. Well, who else could I tell you? Well, I'm going to pull up my fancy list of books that I have here, because I've read a lot of really great ones recently. Manhunt. I don't know if I'm writing an essay about this right now, but Manhunt by Gretchen Felker Martin is a really fabulous speculative horror novel from the perspective of trans women during a zombie apocalypse. Look that up for sure. Although I will note, you have to be in the right headspace to read it because it's really, really graphic.
Yeah.
Like I had to start it at one point and then stop it and then come back to it because it's very graphic and it can be very disturbing. So there is definitely a trigger warning associated with that.
For sure.
I read a lot of creative nonfiction as well, and a lot of environmental nonfiction. And a book that I come back to all the time is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And that's going into its 60th year. And what makes that book so special is that, you read a lot of environmental and anti-capitalist fiction right now, or anti-capitalist nonfiction right now, and it never offers you a solution. And I revisit Silent Spring a couple times. Like basically, I reread Silent Spring like every few years because Carson is a master. She's a journalist, and Carson is a master of making the average person care and offering them reasons why this matters to them. And I think that's really missing from a lot of the kind of work that we look at right now. And it's something that I'm hoping to improve in my next book, which I'm working on right now.
Nice.
And who else have I been reading recently? There's just so many good books. Like I've read a ton of them. Pleasure Politics I read recently. That was amazing.
Amazing.
It's an amazing book, and it like so affirming. Just looking through all the books I've read in the last little while, and I've read a lot. Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks is something that I read recently that I really, really loved, and it especially where they talk about language and the importance of that language and how language builds on our value sets in ways that we don't really think about until we pull them apart.
Yeah, Bell Hooks does do that a lot. I think it was, I forget which book of hers, but in like the introduction part, she was like, I wrote this book for people like my mom who had like a 8th grade education. I want people to be able to like listen to these ideas and be able to actually understand them. So yeah, Bell Hooks is incredible.
Yeah, just so many like I've read so many. I'm just looking back at my bookshelf right now, and like I read a lot of different things, and I try to read a lot of different voices, and I never stop reading a book even if I hate it. Because the thing that I learn from a book that I hate is what I don't want. And what I don't want to say.
Yeah.
And again, going back to In Defense of Looting, that book is a really good example of that. That was a slog. That was a miserable read. And a perplexing read. But nonetheless, one that I finished because it taught me what I didn't want to do with my work.
Yeah. I feel like when with books, we take what we need and we leave what we don't. And like sometimes what we need is something we don't want to hear. So I love that. Okay, so Patrick just gave me the 5-minute warning. Last question is it seems like you've been in several other interviews about your book. What is something that you've been wanting to talk about in those interviews but haven't been able to, or like nobody's asked you the right question?
I think the thing that I find the most interesting that people have skirted around is the essay, Call You By Your Name. And I know it is the longest and most challenging piece. But that essay is really important to me in that that essay nearly freaking killed me. But I think that what makes that essay special for me and why I'm really proud of that piece is its ability to move between culpability and forgiveness, and to allow the reader to inhabit both the space of the accuser and the accused at various points, and to toggle between being the oppressed and the oppressor from both of those positions.
Absolutely.
That was the most terrifying essay to write, and I worked very hard at making myself not be necessarily, for lack of a better word, the hero. I wanted to be very honest about my own positions of power and the things that I learned from that space about race and gender and sex and capitalism and power. And it was crushing. It was crushing to read. It was crushing to write, and it was crushing to read after I had finished it. And I would say that I paid the highest emotional price for that. And so I just think it's funny that no one ever asks me about that essay. And I think it's because it's difficult.
It is difficult. It is like the most personal essay in here. I actually have, if I can read this quote from your book in that essay that speaks to exactly what you were saying. This is on page 213. What this is about is the way two people can be hurt by the same system while fighting against the same system, about the ways those hurts can turn each person against the other, about how someone can be an enemy and a lover and a stranger and a friend all at the same time. Like that, I just had to pull up that quote because we talked about this quote in book club, and that's why I was like, because we talked about this, all the essays, but yeah.
It's definitely the essay I designed to make you the most uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Like and you like generally everyone. I wanted everyone to be uncomfortable.
You did you got it was a really hard essay to read, and yeah.
That's just always the one that I always think it's funny no one ever brings up.
Yeah. Well, for whoever is interviewing you next, now they have this, and if they want to really get down and dirty, they can ask you about that essay. I did not, but that is okay because this was a wonderful discussion anyways. I have no more questions, and we're like ending the live stream. So if our audience has been very quiet today, that is okay. So if anybody has any other questions, feel free to comment them now. Lori, do you want to like maybe plug in like your website, anything that you think people should?
I mean, folks can find me on Twitter at box_e_Lori, Lori. And I do have a website. It's linked in my Twitter bio. Not a huge Insta or TikTok user. That's a little too much noise and sound for me. But I'm hoping to have another book coming out in a little bit, and I've got a lot of essays coming out with the Tyee and Outside Online and The Guardian in the next little while. So my name will be out there, and folks can start getting a little taste of what my next book is going to be like.
Wonderful. I also wanted to ask, because this character does pop up in your book a lot, how's Herman? Is Herman good? Herman was a beautiful character.
Hey, buddy. Are you good?
I heard like a dog, and I was like, I'm just going to ask about Herman real quick.
Come here, Herman. Come here, big guy. People are asking how you're doing. Come here.
He's like, no.
Come here.
Oh my gosh, you're doing well. Oh, look at that boy. Beautiful. Amazing. Oh, Herman, you've got fans. You've got fans.
This little munchkin is his new big sister.
Oh, hello.
Audrey here.
Amazing. Wow. Well, maybe
Herman's 13. Maybe and Audrey is 8 months.
Oh my gosh.
Well, it's a lot of work.
That is, yeah.
So
well, maybe she'll be in.
Happy and they're both doing great.
I love that. That was beautiful. I loved it. I love dogs. That was a great outro. We are out of time. And that was our talk with Lori Fox. You can get their book, This Has Always Been a War, if you're in the New Haven area. If you're in the New Haven area, you can get their book at Possible Futures, which is a new woman-owned bookstore. And yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope y'all have a great